IVM.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast supported by Pragati, a flagship media initiative of the Takshashila Institution. We're a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like to bring a fresh perspective to Indian affairs and an Indian perspective to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello everyone, I'm Pranay and I'm appearing on ATP after a long time. And today I have a really special guest with me. I have with me Dr. Mathieu Duchâtel. He's a director of the Asia program at the Institut Montaigne in France. And he works on semiconductor geopolitics, a topic that is dear to me, and we have had many such episodes on All Things Policy before. Mathieu recently authored a report, The Weak Links in China's Drive for Semiconductors, and now he's working on a related paper on industrial policies in semiconductors. And the backdrop to this conversation is that the government of India recently launched a $10 billion investment over the next 6 years. It's a plan for $10 billion investment over the next 6 years to develop the semiconductor industry in India. And the plan focuses broadly on all stages of production and not just semiconductor fabs. So we thought it would be a great topic to discuss because semiconductors and industrial policy are not unfamiliar to each other. There has been a lot of government intervention in this industry from a long time ago. So we thought we'll have this conversation on what are the merits, demerits of this policy, how do we see it panning out? And that's what this conversation is about. I hope you folks enjoy it. So first of all, before I begin the conversation, we'll just define what an industrial policy is. So industrial policy is broadly a targeted and directed government intervention, which is intended to achieve something specific, a specific target, a specific commercial outcome within a national border. So for example, if the government of India says, I am going to invest 50% of the project cost in a semiconductor fab, if you come and set up an industry in India, then it is an industrial policy. Contrast that with non-targeted interventions, something like broader general interventions for improving the infrastructure or improving the research and development infrastructure. Those things do not fall under industrial policies. They are government interventions, but they are not meant for a specific industry. They are broader interventions, broadly meant for, say, improving human development indicators, etc., or education. They are broad interventions which try to improve the market conditions and not necessarily pick a winner or a loser in a specific sector or industry. So that is what industrial policy is, and it has been doing the rounds not just in India but in China, in EU, in US, and in many other places. So let's get started with that conversation. Mathieu, welcome. And I want to begin right up front. What is the current status of the debate in the EU on the question of what should the government's role in semiconductors be? Now, we know we've heard of this Digital Compass Act, and by 2030, they want to double the semiconductor production, etc. So could you give us an idea of what the debate is in EU really?
Hi, Pranay, and thanks a lot for having me. I'm really glad to be part of that conversation with you on semiconductors and industrial policy. It's indeed very timely. It's very timely for India. It's also very timely for the EU. The EU does not have industrial policy in its DNA, right? The EU was not created to conduct industrial policies, but it's turning to industrial policies, and the semiconductor sector has been one of the drivers of that change. I really like your definition, targeted government intervention. I would add on sectors that are seen and defined as strategic for the future of a country, for what matters, an organization like the EU. And the EU does have the label industrial policy for a number of sectors, not only semiconductors, also electric batteries and hydrogen, for example. But semiconductors is really an area for which the EU is redesigning its instruments to keep a strong semiconductor ecosystem in Europe And as you said, and this is the language of the current Commission, to ensure that the share of Europe in semiconductors, in the global semiconductor market, increases by 2030. There's a number of instruments that the EU is using, but the most important one is currently still in the phase of being designed. It's called the CHIPS Act, like in the US, and it's meant to give the EU the means to support the semiconductor industry more than its current instruments actually give the EU the means to. There's a number of instruments that the EU is using to support the semiconductor industry right now. But what is really striking is that it's kind of scattered. You have support for research and development projects, but it's really bottom down. Basically, it's for some companies to come together or research centers and to really apply for EU funding for a research project, which actually, together, if you bring it together, the long-term EU budget for strategic investment in the category single market, innovation, and digital for the next 6 years, so it's a research and development budget, is more than 30 billion euros, but it's very hard to say right now how much will go to support the semiconductor industry. Then you have, and it's linked to COVID-19, you have for the first time an EU recovery package to intervene in the European economies, and it has targeted green transformation and digital transformations as strategic priorities. And there is a big envelope for projects in the semiconductor industry. But again, it's a bottom-down approach. And I think this is very important to understand how the EU acts compared to other countries. So far, it's always about picking projects that actually come from the industry. It's true of the recovery package. It's also true of the, and I'm sorry to speak EU language. It's sometimes hard to understand for people who are not working for the EU. Actually, it's hard for everyone. It's called the Important Project of Common European Interest, IPCEI. It's basically a funding instrument of the European Commission to work with member states and to again support projects, and that's really targeted to support the semiconductor industry, and it comes from industry again, picking projects, supporting them, and that's another mode of EU intervention. The CHIPS Act is different because it's supposed to be larger scale, and it's supposed to answer the question of should the EU place resources in support of creating on European soil advanced fabs, so moving to manufacturing. As you have heard from me, the EU has the tendency to support R&D projects coming from industry, and the support for manufacturing capacities is really something that the EU is not really doing.
Fascinating. Yeah, we'll go into more details of each of the things that you said. But broadly, what would you classify as the driving forces for this kind of change in policy, right? I mean, the debate is similar in the US as well. Surprisingly, there is a consensus across the Republicans and Democrats that the government needs an industrial policy for semiconductors, right? And that was the debate even in India. And I guess I'll tell you the driving forces in India, and maybe you can tell about EU as well. So one driving force is definitely China. The fact that a lot of our products come from China, electronics equipments are brought from China. So even though China does not manufacture chips, as you have written and we know significantly, but it is generally perceived as this idea that a lot of our electronics equipments or the 5G infrastructure, 4G infrastructure could come from China. So we want to sort of replace that with indigenous infrastructure. So that is sort of one driving force. The second driving force, like you said, is this idea of COVID, right? And the fact that there is greater support for governments doing investments, even though they might not necessarily do that well. But there is a lot of support that governments need to do some massive investments. So that is another driving force which is combined in India for the government to make such a big commitment over the next 6 or 7 years. So what's the case like in the EU?
I think it's pretty similar. There's this question of disruptions in the supply chain and the lessons from the shortages that started in the automotive sector at the end of last year, and in fact expanded to a larger scope of consumers of semiconductors. And it really raised the awareness in Europe about the dependence on access to semiconductor technology, and in particular to semiconductors, manufactured products being purchased from Asia. So this idea of resilience, how to ensure that European access to semiconductors can withstand geopolitical crisis and other sorts of disruptions in the values chain is really a very strong driver. And the second one is really the US-China competition. And in fact, I think there is a linkage to the Huawei 5G story as seen from Europe. The restrictions placed by the US, first the Trump administration, but continued by the Biden administration on Huawei's access to semiconductor technology has had an impact on many third parties, including in Europe. And this has also strengthened in the way the idea that the EU should support not self-sufficiency. I don't think anyone speaks about self-sufficiency. I think everyone realizes it's an illusion, so it's not really part of the discussion, but resilience in terms of access. And when the Commission's president, Ursula von der Leyen, speaks of industrial policies for the semiconductor sector, she says it's a matter of competitiveness for Europe, but it's also a matter of tech sovereignty. So, sovereignty, when you speak of the EU, is not an obvious concept because the EU is not a country, but you have to think of this as building elements of sovereignty, something dynamic. And I think the idea of addressing vulnerabilities and strengthening the resilience of Europe to be able to survive future shocks is a key driver of what we see happening currently in Europe.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Now, like EU, for example, already has quite a bit of presence in the semiconductor space, right? So right from the R&D space where we start with IMEC, Belgium, or you talk about the lithography and EUV, ASML from Netherlands leads that. Then there are a lot of automotive manufacturers who are the customers for the final manufactured chip, and they also do their own design for a specific ADAS kind of advanced driver assistance systems, chips, etc. So there are already so many elements which exist in the EU, right? And when you want to build resilience, isn't resilience just about then that you don't want to be dependent on one particular geography or one particular adversary, right? So as long as EU could have access to facilities, let's say outside the region which is now under a lot of scrutiny, let's say there are access in US or India or Israel, that should suffice the resilience point, isn't it?
Yeah, I think what you point to is the fact that clearly the European industry has some strengths, which you named, but this really leads to the key debate currently in Europe. And it's not only in Europe, actually. It's the same debate in the US and it's the same debate in Japan. And there are different interests, different stakeholders, and we are still undergoing this debate. So the debate is, should we support our key strengths? And there are indeed equipment such as advanced lithography or the R&D scene in Europe, which is indeed quite strong, or the design for specific industrial consumers, such as the automotive industry, the startup ecosystem, or should we direct European resources to build an advanced fab in Europe? Advanced fab meaning, crossing the threshold of 7 nanometers manufacturing, which currently is only a technology used by Samsung in Korea and TSMC in Taiwan. I think the most advanced fab in Europe is 22 nanometers. The industry, the European industry, the consumers say that they don't really need an advanced fab on European soil, that they can rely on global value chains to actually import, and that anyway, the market for 7, 5, 3, 2 nanometers is really very specific today. It's the state of the art of digital technologies, and you don't really need it for the automotive industry or aeronautics. Other people argue that, with that technology comes new applications and innovation. So it's good for the ecosystem in Europe to have a 5 nanometer fab in Europe, because it will lead, really spearhead the transformation of the European industry and the transformation of European R&D. But that's where we are currently. And unlike the US, actually, the US has made its decision. It has heavily subsidized TSMC to build a fab in Arizona. There are many questions regarding that fab, and I'm still hearing Taiwanese friends in the semiconductor industry who have doubts that this is commercially viable. But this is a political project to some extent, and it's going on anyway. And so, unlike the US, the EU is still having its internal debate regarding what to prioritize.
Oh, yeah, I think the term you use, political project, I think that's what is primarily the driving force in so many countries on semiconductors now. And it's not new. For example, in the 80s, when US feared that a lot of manufacturing is moving to Japan and the memory manufacturing. And again, there was this resurgence of industrial policy. You had Sematech, etc. A lot of funding went into that. Not all of it was successful. The industry anyways moved out to Asia. But now, after around 30 years or so, we are seeing a resurgence that this is now a political project. It is far too critical to be left to external players, and we need to do something on our own. I guess that's the general sentiment which is emerging. So let's deep dive into this further. What kind of industrial policies are under consideration in the EU? You already mentioned about the grants for advanced fabs, etc. Is there any other things, like is the government considering preferential contracts for local manufacturers or tax credits or anything like that?
Yeah, so among the things that are being discussed at the moment, there's indeed this question of how to incentivize European R&D to be industrialized in Europe. That's a very tough question, actually, to find the right instruments to actually incentivize those research outputs produced by European research centers to actually nurture the European industrial ecosystem. So that's one question. There's a big move of the EU on competition policy to remove the obstacles that currently exist, because the EU is very strict on government subsidies, to in fact create an exception for the semiconductor industry, so that the rules that apply on the European continent are being, not applies that strictly to the semiconductor industry, and that would lead, in fact, to the possibility of subsidizing. How to subsidize? Is it subsidizing capital expenditure, or is it tax exemption? It's not clear at this stage, to be honest. I think it's one of the central discussions of the European Chips Act. And we will only know by the end of the first semester of 2022, which are the options that have been selected by policymakers.
Right. Now, coming to semiconductor manufacturing, there is almost a common belief that Taiwan or South Korea, the successes of them in semiconductors were because of industrial policies by governments. Now, that's sort of like a urban myth, or there is some truth to it, but it's generally believed that that was one big reason. Although there were many other things which happened, trade liberalization, etc., which enabled it. So, what do you think? Like, is given that the manufacturing costs are only rising and it's becoming even tougher to squeeze the juice out of lower nodes like 2 nanometers for marginal improvements, given that it's become difficult, would some form of industrial policy from governments, does it look inevitable, or can the semiconductor industry work just fine without new big industrial policy instruments going ahead?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question. And in fact, when you speak to industry, there's always the same answer that comes back. I think, human resources. And if you look at each of these countries, the education part is so important. So it's not strictly semiconductor industrial policy, but it's so much part of the success of those countries that you have mentioned, South Korea, Taiwan. And it's such a huge challenge for the other countries that want to strengthen their semiconductor ecosystem. For China, it's one of the main obstacles that China faces. It's estimated that China would need to hire 300,000 well-trained engineers to reach its targets of producing on Chinese soil 70% of what China consumes. China is only at 15% today, so it's a long way before it gets there. And it's the same in Europe. If you ask companies, and I recently had an interview with ASML, and they were explaining to me that they have to hire 3,000 people in the Netherlands next year, and they're not sure where to find them, etc., etc. So I think that's one key area for government intervention as part of a long-term process. And it's the same in the US. When you speak to TSMC regarding the fab in Arizona, obviously they picked Arizona because there is already a semiconductor industry. So you have an ecosystem of well-trained people, but the question of is it going to be enough is really an important one. So, that's really the perspective of industry. They say, support our research projects, help us with human resources, and don't subsidize non-European companies to come to Europe and build a fab, because in the end, it's a competition for public resources among companies, right? If you change the perspective and you look at it from the perspective of companies and no longer from the perspective of the strategic interest of country A or country B, the outlook is very different.
Yeah, no, absolutely. A lot of industry associations in the US are also the biggest supporters of any kind of subsidy, and it's understandably so, right? Why would you not try to take advantage of this moment and get more funding for? But that's the interesting part about this domain, right? So, for example, even if everything was to be manufactured in, let's say, India or US or EU, yet all the output, all the chips that are manufactured there can't be absorbed in EU, US, or India singularly, right? So we'll still be exporting a large part of it, which means that some of it will go into, some of your public money will go into building the industries of other countries. So similarly, even on the import side, it's not as if any country can build all the products that they want at their home. So they'll still import chips which will be from the outside, maybe at some other nanometer range, etc. So that's sort of, it's really tough to assign a measurable metric for success of industrial policy in semiconductors, don't you think?
I fully agree with your point. And to me, I would rephrase this and put the emphasis on demand. It's so difficult to estimate demand especially for usages that we don't know yet, because there's a lot of innovation that will happen in the digital sphere. And it's a big conversation in Europe. Exactly. You say a fab, let's say, a TSMC 5 nanometers fab in Germany, heavily subsidized by Europe and the German government, who's going to consume those semiconductors? So people who oppose the idea, they will tell you, yeah, but in the end, the consumers are going to be in the US and in East Asia, because that's where the digital industry is thriving, and we don't really have that in Europe. We have automotive. But some other people tell you the automotive industry will change so much. And actually, there's a study by McKinsey that predicts that by 2024, 8% of the demands in Europe will be for semiconductors, 7 nanometers and below. There's another study by Kearney that estimates that by 2030, 43% of non-memory integrated circuits will be for generations around 5 nanometers. But those studies have very different conclusions. And in fact, when you ask the government officials, this is their biggest problem. They don't know how to estimate the demand. And of course, it's a bet for the future. If you subsidize heavily one industry and you don't have the market, that creates a non-commercially viable endeavor, and it's a failure. So that's really the key question indeed.
Yeah, right. And by 2037 nanometers would become the 28 or 65 nanometers of today, right? Like from a perception lens, it will no longer be the leading edge. So question is, we want to predict what will happen in 2030 based on investments that we have to make now. And it's really tough to do because so much of it is uncertain. Now, coming back to one more point that you mentioned, you're a China expert and you work closely on China issues. So now, as you mentioned about the Make in China 2025 and the Made in China project itself is nowhere close to the target that they had set. In fact, the government conveniently doesn't mention it anymore, that they need to have 70% local production, etc. So how are the Chinese industrial policies on semiconductors any different from, let's say, what the US is trying to do or what EU is contemplating as well?
Yeah, I think there are some interesting differences. I mean, first, of course, the scale and the ambition, right? I mean, China is in the global top 6, but it speaks of leadership. The goal of Chinese policies to gain leadership status for China in the semiconductor industry. So it's a very bold goal. High ambitions, I think, would be the first one. Then I think Chinese industrial policies have to face a different reality from other countries because the Chinese ecosystem is being targeted by specific restrictions in terms of access to semiconductor technology. And in fact, it's been the policy of the US in the past 20 years to keep the Chinese industry behind by about two to three generations. And it's still the case today, and it's been quite successful. For example, you take the leading Chinese manufacturer, SMIC, they cannot access extreme ultraviolet lithography from ASML because ASML won't get the export license. Without that technology, SMIC is not going to be able to produce semiconductors of the 7 nanometers generation. So China has to direct its support to going around those restrictions, which I think is different from other countries. And you can observe that, for example, if you look at the largest government fund called the Big Fund for the integrated circuits, if you look at its target, it's been moving from supporting manufacturing and design to actually equipment, slowly moving to helping Chinese companies working on equipment to get additional funding from government because China needs to go around those restrictions. I think what also makes China different is the importance of local governments and the fact that, maybe contrary to other countries, The way the Chinese government works is maybe bolder, and you have examples of incredible failures by their scale, right? Over investment and moving too fast and waste of government resources. I'm thinking of Wuhan Hongxin in the city of Wuhan, uh, which completely failed, and it was a huge project of billion of US dollars, and it completely failed. But overall, the Chinese model accepts waste. It's almost a natural selection. Waste is part of a natural selection process. Everyone gets funding, and some will fail, but some will succeed. That's part of the natural process of selecting the winners, which is, of course, a key question for industrial policies.
Fascinating. Yeah. So my thinking on this was obviously some of the industrial policies that China is engaging in sort of violate the WTO norms as well. So I guess that's one difference. But overall, qualitatively, I guess the aim of what China started is not very different from what the other countries are trying, that you want to have a larger amount of production at home, etc., right? And of course, not to say that there are other instruments aren't used. So for example, industrial espionage, etc., also has been used by China, but we are limiting the scope to industrial policies. And what I see is, first, it started with China doing this Made in China 2025, roughly in 2015. A lot of countries woke up and said, hey, China is doing something, now we need to up our socks, change our game, etc. And all of them are trying the same exact policies broadly that China did in Made in China 2025. So it's sort of it's paradoxical that it started as a response to China, but the instruments which are being considered, etc., are quite similar.
Yeah, it's indeed China has been changing us in the way we approach the things, and I think it's also because the way China practices economic statecraft. I think a lot of countries realize that if there is a Chinese superiority over one segment of the supply chain, then there is a risk that during times of political tensions in your relationship with China, this will be used as leverage to extract concessions or to weaken your resolve. And that's one thing you hear a lot from Japan, for example. And it's very ironical in a way, because Japan has been the country that practiced dumping for its semiconductor industry in the 70s, 80s. And now you hear Japanese government officials or experts telling you there's a big risk that if the industry moves to China, China will just kill its foreign competitors with dumping. And so, there's this perception of risks linked to Chinese progress, which is very specific to China. In fact, no other countries poses such perceived threats or elicits such threat assessments today in the world. And I think that's entirely geopolitics and our understanding or our assessment of how China behaves internationally, which leads governments to be more cautious and to approach this issue from the angle of resilience.
Yeah, no, that's a really great point on the way China practices economic statecraft. And we've seen multiple examples of it, right? Australia, China, and they not getting the wine from Australia because of political tensions, etc. So it's like an all front assault on a particular nation state if they want to. And because the instruments are so controlled with the Chinese government, they can do that, right? Whereas in EU or US or India, the interests of the industries might be very different from those of the government, and they might still want to have freer trade, but in China's case, it will be different. I want to just end this conversation with a few ideas on industrial policy itself. So now there are lots of arguments against industrial policy, right? So wanted to discuss those with you, and let's see what you think on the EU side as well. So for example, two or three things that I have come across. The main arguments against are: one, as we already discussed, government is trying to predict the industries, technologies, and products of the future. And it's like the Hayek's famous thing, right? Use of knowledge in society. When knowledge is centralized, it generally leads to poorer outcomes rather than when knowledge is distributed. So here, the government is picking not just semiconductors as an industry, but also specific areas in semiconductors, like say compound semiconductors, or you might want to pick up a particular technology node, etc. So this is really tough to do, and governments are not so nimble, agile at doing this. Today they have invested. What if tomorrow's technology is different? That money might you might divert important resources to an exercise which was very difficult to predict in the first place. That's the first argument. Second argument is wasteful money argument, right? Every rupee that government invests, there's an opportunity cost involved. So why would you want to invest in this industry rather than other industries, which or a general improvements in, let's say, education, healthcare, etc., which are perhaps broader instruments that can help many industries and not just the semiconductor industry. The third one is, even if the industrial policy succeeds, maintaining its success over time is really difficult, because you need very high regulatory capacity to avoid rent seeking. There are lots of players who are once into the game will change and modify the policy so that others don't come in, right? And that's, I think, the principal challenge for the Indians point of view, because I think India can invest in, let's say, a broad range of semiconductor industry, not just fabs but other stages. But our central problem is this rent seeking. How do we avoid that? How do we design an industrial policy instrument so that it doesn't become an instrument for the incumbents to keep out the new competitors? So what's it like in the EU on these counts?
Yeah, very, very good points. I'd say, one of the lessons of the COVID-19 crisis and of the discussion on disruptions, and I know you wrote about self-sufficiency as a bad idea. I think people share this view in Europe. Self-sufficiency is a bad idea. But what is really important is to own choke points, because what we are facing is a global values chain, which overall will still remain driven by interdependence. I mean, we're still going to trade with China. And in fact, China is probably going to be the winner, in fact, of the shortages in the automotive sectors. Because if you look at additional manufacturing capacity in the next 2 to 3 years, part of the solution for the automotive industry will come from investments that is occurring in China right now. But the way of surviving an interdependent global value chains with exceptions, and in the context of strategic rivalry between states that cause disruptions and that will cause disruptions in the future, is not self-sufficiency, it's to own choke points. I think owning your own choke points to make sure that you have something that is indispensable for other industries. And of course, in the case of the EU, the one that comes to mind is extreme ultraviolet lithography, that really strengthens the strategic position of Europe in the global values chain, because that's something everyone else needs and everyone else wants. Owning choke points is something that government intervention should strengthen when there's already a choke point, and maybe create when there's no choke points already owned. And that's a question of strategic positioning of your country in the global ecosystem. And the second point I would make, clearly the key decision for governments is to prioritize strengthening your strengths or addressing your vulnerabilities. And it's a very complicated question, but in practice, the industry in your country will always want the government to strengthen the strengths because they do have strengths. So it's a complicated discussion. It depends a lot on predicting demand when it comes to addressing vulnerabilities. And it's such, a strategic decision with huge consequences for the industry that it's something that is crucial everywhere. And the way I see it in Europe is that, a decision has been made to target the strengths. It's clear. That's where all the existing instruments are going. But then if we can direct additional resources to the sector, should we move to addressing vulnerabilities as well? And to me, that's where we are in Europe right now. At least you have a clear sequence: one, strengthening the strengths, and maybe two, addressing the vulnerabilities. But it's not it's not a given that all states will follow the same sequence, right?
Right. No, this is fascinating. So I just want to end with slight discussion on this point. So my conception of this from an Indian point of view was sort of unilaterally strengthen your strengths, but multilaterally address the vulnerabilities. So why I say that is, for example, on manufacturing, we are so far behind the curve that we can't suddenly become, we can reduce our vulnerabilities alone in any meaningful way, right? Even if we have a 65 or 28 nanometer fab tomorrow, it's not as if all our 5G infrastructure is going to be produced in them, or our mobiles are going to have them because they'll have 7 nanometers or whatever, or even our defense equipment will have them because most of our equipment actually comes from outside India. So from that lens, what I thought was some things like the Quad supply chain initiative on semiconductors is a good model, not just for the Quad, but even the EU and other trusted partners can be brought in so that you at least ensure that your vulnerabilities are not against an adversary at this point, right? So you can build in a multilateral understanding such that you are assured of access. Of course, I mean, in some parallel world that access can be broken, there things happen, but broadly in a trusted ecosystem you can build some sort of resilience against vulnerabilities. You don't have to do everything on your own. So that was sort of a proposition from my end on India's point of view. What do you think?
I think it's a very good point, and it makes me think of the Transatlantic Trade and Technology Council that the EU and the US have created this year, and that has a semiconductor working group. And the first meeting took place earlier this year, and for the semiconductor working group, it concluded that on the short term, the US and the EU will work together to address the question of, short-term issues with supply chains. But on the longer term, it might be more ambitious. And in fact, the reason why we are only focusing on the short term, addressing issues of shortages, etc., is simply because the EU has not finalized its approach to, government support for the industry. So it's very hard at this stage to engage in meaningful bilateral or multilateral cooperation beyond this issue of addressing short-term problems with the supply chain when the overall design of your support for the sector has not been finalized. But I think that the TTC is a good model. Of course, it's a bilateral setting, but it could be replicated with other countries, and it could be multilateralized to some extent. In fact, I think it would be a good idea to move beyond this bilateral setting for the semiconductor industry in particular, and to strengthen, allied cooperation on issues of resilience and, access to semiconductor technology indeed.
Yeah. So that was a fascinating conversation, Mathieu. Thank you so much for taking time out.
Thanks so much. Yeah.
And this is a space to keep a lookout for. There will be a lot happening on semiconductors and industrial policies. So tune in, and probably we'll do another episode sometime in the future. Thank you.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com. or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.
Hey, it's been another great week on the IVM Podcast Network. On Pesa Vesa, Anupam is joined by Dr. Gayatri Vasudevan from LaborNet Services. They discuss the challenges and opportunities faced by the informal labor sector in India. On the Life Manifesto, Zarina teaches us how to deal with self-abandonment. On Smarter with Sid, we take a look at what happened over 100 years ago in the 1920s, where the situation was pretty similar to our 2020s. Agriculture played a very vital role in the flourishing of human civilization. Dr. Rajiv and Manik Deshmukh talk about this phenomena on Marathi Kirkitun. The lion is not a pet animal, but it can be adopted by a zoo. On Hansavani, we hear about the strange man who was keen on experiencing the grandeur of the lion. Do follow us on social media. We're IVM Podcast on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. If you're enjoying this show or any of our other shows for that matter, do tell a friend. The word of mouth absolutely is essential to us. Don't forget to rate us on any other platforms that you've been listening to. And also, I'd like to ask everybody to check us out on YouTube. We have a number of channels going. You can find all of them on ivmpodcast.com/YouTube. And finally, we'd like to thank our sponsors this week, Cred, Bank of Baroda, CoinSwitch Kuber, and Intel. Thank you so much for making this possible.
A wise man once said, traveling, it makes you speechless, then turns you into a storyteller.
Well, listen to such travel stories and experiences exploring India on the Musafir Stories with us, Saif and Faiza.
Catch us on the IVM website, app, or wherever you get your podcasts from.